Welcome back, divers. This is the first episode of a new series, a monthly recap of Helldivers 2, the good, the bad, and the ugly. This isn't about hating on the game or blind defense of it. It's intended to be constructive criticism, highlighting the wins, the problems, and the frustrations so Arrowhead can keep making things even better. So let's dive in. First, I'll talk about the good. Arrowhead has been continuing to deliver us some creative weapons and armors and stratagems to use, which is awesome. Each one of them typically feels distinct and fun to use. I know, like the new solo silo is pretty cool, right? It's like a precision guided cruise missile. I respect their design philosophy of like believability over strict realism. The balance between immersion and gameplay fun is part of what makes Helldivers 2 like so unique. Even if they don't always get this exactly right, and players have their opinions about whether it is working out well. The Rupture Strain was a very cool addition. It genuinely, I think, adds teamwork and requires thoughtful planning to engage them effectively. Now, admittedly, it arrived with some major issues, performance problems, and things like that. The concept itself is still strong. And I do want to give credit here. Arrowhead has acknowledged most of these problems in their most recent updates, written blogs and updates. And so while it is frustrating, some of the backlog of these issues is somewhat understandable. We have to keep in mind that this is a multi-company, multi-platform collaboration between Arrowhead, Sony, Microsoft, and whoever they might be engaging in for crossover content. And so this means that fixes and content passes and updates is probably always going to move a bit more slowly than we would like. And that's in addition to the triangle of a product being fast, cheap, or good quality, and that you can really only have two of those. And it's my opinion that Helldivers 2 basically chooses to be cheap or low cost to the consumer, good quality overall, but without the fast ability of or the ability of fast updates and patches. So we have to endure these longer periods of problems, at least for now. But anyway, so that's sort of the gist of the good things going for Helldivers 2 this month. Now we'll move on to the problems that need work. The official known issues list still has some pretty big issues. Some of them have been there for a while. Things like extraction shuttles clipping into the terrain, drills spawning on top of caves, weapon scopes have the wrong field of vision, armor pieces that don't line up, like with the cinder block armor, and XP modifiers seem to be miscalculating. And performance is another huge pain point, and I feel this myself. Crashes, freezes, stuttering, very common across any platform. On console, for me, and others that are also on like PS5 or Xbox, full system crashes are still happening a lot. Even Arrowhead CEO admitted the team is fighting against technical debt, which slows down the fixes. Gameplay balance also has some pretty big problems at the moment. The Rupture Strain was so broken at launch that it had to be disabled entirely, and Arrowhead gave an estimated fixed timeline of about 5 weeks before it returns, which is a big setback for a major content drop, even if they were honest about it. Although, I do want to keep in mind that this content drop was free for all players. The Warbond itself and those weapons you still have to purchase, but all of the content and the story things and the general expansions to mission types and all that and enemy types, that is technically free. So we should be fair in recognizing that nuance. But then we've got things like the Dragon Roaches, which are basically as strong as Bile Titans, except they can fly with all the same amount of tankiness, or so it would seem. They are frequently spawning in at rates that are a bit too high. Their hitboxes do not match their models. The fire can land pretty far away from you, but you still get caught on fire and take massive damage. I think generally fighting them would feel fine. If they fixed those things, maybe reduced the spawn rate a little bit, and if their wings made a little bit more sense. We can currently damage their wings, but it doesn't have any effect on their and how they approach the player. So if those types of things could get tweaked and adjusted, then it might be just fine if they can get that done in a timely manner. And on top of these things, patches sometimes fix one thing but break another. Reward scaling on high difficulty missions is still a bit off. Extraction failures happen in some ways that are not exactly on the known issues list. I know that I've seen the Pelican just kind of hang out up there far in excess of the normal 10 seconds, which can be a problem. And generally speaking, players feel kind of frustrated and left in the dark whenever communications about updates and stuff like that are few and far between. And fair enough. Now moving on to sort of the more ugly points, and some of this is things that I've personally seen. I've seen that the snake crawl animation is still a glitch, or maybe it has returned. I don't know. It's happening on a regular basis again now after ragdolling. Again, I mentioned pelicans hovering awkwardly for long periods of times before landing. Boatless enemies I've seen be able to knock players down with a basic melee swing, which is kind of funny, but also not good. Boatless, in particular, clip through walls and terrain, and they are able to hit players where players can't fight back. This is especially a problem with the flesh mobs, and this has been going on for a while. I think since they launched them. Sometimes boatless hordes seem to spawn right on top of objectives or within a block or two, even though these things should really be spawning either from the ship reinforcement or from a dedicated spawn point or something like that, but they're very obviously not adhering to those established play rules, I guess you might call it. Other times I've seen boatless soak up more damage than their health should allow. I've had instances, even just yesterday, I was firing at a boatless, and it may have been a heavier unit, but he took 5 point-blank Punisher shotgun blasts to kill. I blew his legs off, and while he was dragging, I put 4 more shots into his body before he would die. And they should have a maximum of 260 HP, 160 standard HP, and then the 100 HP Constitution as a bleed out. But at point blank range from a Punisher shotgun, I mean, that's 405 damage potentially, and most of those pellets should be hitting. So I don't know what's going on with that sometimes. Maybe it's related to networking issues, which are also still prevalent. Performance isn't that good for me. Like I said, I play on PlayStation 5 Pro, and I crash pretty often. My friends and other people who are also on it, they have the same problems. Stratagem inputs have been pretty glitchy lately, I've noticed. If my stratagem input code ends with an up arrow input, sometimes what will happen is my character will stem, and then I'll still have the stratagem ball in my hand afterwards. And so it seems that it is taking that solo input and applying it multiple times for some reason. This can also happen with emote triggers that'll occur at the end of stratagem inputs. And things like trying to dive. I use the double tap circle on my controller to be able to dive, and often I find my player character is just spam crouching instead of diving out of the way, which is problematic when you need to dive to cover. And night missions are a particular pain point for me, and presumably for other console players, or at least PlayStation 5 players. I have a Samsung 4K TV, and I also have an Acer monitor, both of which are fully rated for PS5 Pro. And during nighttime missions, especially with the boatless Illuminate missions, the maps can be completely pitch black. And without some kind of flashlight, I cannot see anything around me within 10 meters in front of me or less. But the enemies can still see me perfectly fine, and that's very disruptive. This breaks the design philosophy of the Arrowhead themselves. Generally have set up that the AI enemies, their visibility and ability to detect is pretty similar to ours, but these night missions are problematic. And worse, these night missions seem to be very frequent. Over half of the ops, it seems, start either at dusk or night, and even daytime missions will often slide into darkness by the second or third objective or mission in the operation. And so this is a problem because it makes weapon choice restrictive, because I can't bring, for example, a pump-action shotgun at a night mission because they do not have flashlight attachment options, and so that would render that useless in one of those situations. And this leads me right into balance and design. I do respect Arrowhead's creativity with weapons and armor, generally speaking, but there are some inconsistencies, right? Won't get into the whole bacon-flavored apples issue, as that's pretty well established at this point. But for example, the 1.5 times optic is, in its description, is considered like the standard for most rifles or guns, but it's only available on a select few. Flashlight and laser combos are not universal, and basic attachments like these should be standard, or at least available, for all of the primary weapons and things like that, which we can customize. Notably shotguns. Pump-action shotguns specifically lack these, which is very frustrating for me, as it's one of the, I would argue that's one of the more common attachments for things like shotguns, but I digress. It should be added, I think. And then some of the things that bother me personally are the animations. Pump actions and bolt actions rather violently kick your reticle off target when you're cycling in first-person view. And from my own experience, and not to lean too heavily on realism necessarily, but growing up on a farm, I had some military service, and I've done a lot of run-and-gun competitive shooting. It's really not how a pump action or a bolt action works. These actions are designed to be smooth so that you can stay on target. Even if you were doing a maneuver like slam firing a shotgun, which is holding the trigger while you pump the action rapidly for a faster fire rate, your sight picture doesn't really get disrupted the way that it does in the game. In the game, it really cants the whole optic and gun off to the side pretty significantly and disrupts your vision, and it's just the cycling already limits your fire rate. So the animation doesn't also need to obscure your vision, and in my case, and in my opinion, I find this very frustrating. And sometimes it's a little bit almost nauseating if things are really mixed up, and then I also have that going on. I don't really see that as a believability or realism component of the design. I feel like I think it's just sort of a poor animation choice. I don't think it's a good design, and I would be super happy if Arrowhead would reanimate that particular part of the cycling for these different guns. Moving on to the War Strider, which is another big talking point. Players are largely divided on whether it's balanced, and many agree that it is fair if you're working as a team or cooperating effectively, but others still say that it is too heavily armored, that it needs a weak point like an exposed heat vent common on other larger enemies, and that its firepower is overwhelming because of the fire rate and the ragdoll mechanics on all of its attacks, which it does have a ragdoll on the lasers, the grenade barrage, and its close range stomp attack, even if it misses you. Personally, I don't think that it really needs a weak point. I think that breaking the mold sometimes with these enemy units, instead of always appealing to the status quo, like having a glowing weak point vent or something, I think that's good for the game sometimes. However, I do agree the ragdoll mechanic combined with the rapid fire rate feel a little overtuned and could use some minor tweaks. From sort of an in-world lore perspective, as far as I can tell, the War Strider's ability to spam lasers and grenades does kind of break the automaton design logic, more so than the lack of a weak point like a vent. Typically, units with high firepower, speed, and armor, they are going to have weak points to offset, sort of the heat buildup, right? So if you look at Hulks, they are more of a close range. They're sort of fast pursuit enemies. They have heavy armor and they're pretty aggressive with their firepower and stuff, but they have this weak point. They actually have a couple. They have the visor and they have the heat vent on the back. Tanks, heavily armored, slower, but they hit hard and they have long range, so they also have these weak points. Barrager tanks, they don't have a vent, but they have their unlimited missile barrage. Not that those have been working correctly for quite some time, but they're offset by being vulnerable to direct fire by medium penetration weapons, right? Factory Striders, heavily armored, mobile, troop deployment, but they have multiple weak points to be able to hit them because they have their top cannon, they have their chin guns, and they've got the deploying of the Devastators from the belly, and so they're a challenging enemy unless you approach them thoughtfully, right? You can't just roll up on one wholesale from the front, or you're going to get gunned down along the way. But they feel better for a lot of players because of those different options. But you have to look at these things sort of holistically in how they present themselves and what weak points they have. But in contrast, the War Strider, it's slow. It doesn't really pursue that aggressively. You can run away from them. And it only really is a major threat at sort of the short to medium range after it sees you. If you outrun it, or you just take it down before it has a chance to see you or lock on, then it's basically a non-issue. But in combat, when there are multiple of them dropping in, the spamminess of its weapons is pretty overwhelming. I've seen anywhere from like 3 to 10 of them spawning at once, even if they do frequently replace hulks and tanks. But it still creates a lot of chaos when you have a large field full of grenade barrages, right? Now, there are some players who argue it doesn't reward precision support weaponry enough, and I kind of see what they mean, but I still think I disagree, and because I don't see that as a good reason to add a vent or other weak point to just turn it into another shoot the glowing spot type of enemy. Precision weapons already do their job very effectively against a lot of enemy units. And even against the War Strider, they still do a reasonably good job because, for example, a max charge railgun only needs like 5 or 6 shots to either the joint or the leg to destroy a War Strider. Same thing, autocannon and the AMR, they can also take it down in like 5 to 12 shots in those locations. And all of these things can be done from well outside the effective range of the War Strider. So. And then another example, the Epoch plasma cannon support weapon. It can kill a War Strider in 2 max charge shots from up to about 120 meters away. That's my preferred method of taking them down. But there are a lot of these options. Whenever I look at reviews or video showcases or clips, whether it's on YouTube or Reddit or what have you, these things are usually being presented while the player is using something like a railgun or an AMR or whatever at very close ranges, like 20, 40 meters, and they're complaining about the ragdoll spam while using these long-range weaponry options, and then they want to complain that it's spamming them too much and all this stuff. And I understand that sometimes enemies drop in and you may need to move into a base, but I don't think it's entirely reasonable to expect a long-range weapon with some short-range application to be able to perform exceptionally well in all distances and against all targets. I think you're just asking too much out of a single weapon, and you are probably leaning into your previously established comfort zone and bias and preference of being able to roll up and sort of do the Helldivers 2 equivalent of a 360 no scope by shooting a Hulk in the face with an AMR or something like that, when this is not that type of enemy. This is a new, stronger variant, which is intended to be more of a challenge that forces you to adapt and change your approach. So if you take advantage of the distance as able, or if you are firing in tandem with someone else, then these enemies go down very quickly within a couple of seconds, right? And so I think we need to appreciate not that they are failing to reward skill precision weapons, but that they are forcing you to modify what that skill looks like, right? Because one shot, one kill, I don't think you should really expect it to be one shot, one kill across the heaviest units. For sure, medium and some heavy units, but you're not going to see that against something like a tank necessarily, or against obviously not a War Strider, but like a Factory Strider and things like that, in cases with like an AMR or a railgun, in all circumstances. If we start adding weak points or lowering thresholds too much, flexible sort of jack of all trades weapons like the Epoch can become far too strong. As I mentioned, it can already two-shot the thing from like 120 meters away, and if we start adjusting the damage thresholds of the Warstrider directly, then we're going to see other weapons be able to absolutely dominate them, and then that will become a problem. So that's just one example of why we have to be careful when we're asking about balance adjustments that seem simple on paper, but they're going to ripple across the whole performance of the entire sandbox. And so while I appreciate the frustrations that players experience, and I've been ragdolled to pieces plenty of times as well, especially while starting to figure out how to use these, how to use my weapons against these things and approach them. We just really have to be careful there when we're asking for those things, because it's easy to get too hyper-focused on our own individual preferred weapons and playstyles and ignore the ramifications for the sandbox of weapons as a whole. And another quick point when considering that is that the Warstrider is also susceptible to stuns. So things like stun grenades, urchin grenades, that arc grenade that bounces around, orbital strikes, EMS mortars, all of those things can stun Warstriders in place. And so you can lock it down plenty long enough to coordinate a kill or take it down yourself, or just get an objective complete and then run away from it. You don't even necessarily have to always kill the Warstriders all the time. So if even one or two players is running stun type weaponry, like you can effectively disable and remove the threat of the Warstrider during a battle, during a firefight. And of course, we need to remember that Helldivers 2 has always been marketed as a teamwork co-op type of game first and foremost. It's in all of the descriptions on all of the websites, whether you look at Xbox, PlayStation, Steam, etc., Arrowhead's website themselves. And it's important to keep that in mind, right? Solo players can succeed, but it's going to be a challenge. Catering too much to solo play would probably reduce variety and the challenge overall to the detriment of the game. If every big enemy were reduced to sort of glowing weak points, then you'd be able to handle them all in the exact same way by bringing like an MG43 or something like that, right? And that would really flatten loadouts, I think. I personally would find that to be rather boring and kind of bad for the game long term, because then you run into issues of players just using the same thing all the time in the opposite direction from like anti-tank, whereas you don't necessarily need everyone to bring anti-tank currently if you're working in a full 4-man squad. But in that case, you would see the shift go the opposite direction, where it's like, oh, well, we'll just bring our MG43 or we'll bring our whatever, right? So, and that argument can kind of go both ways, and I can see that. So I don't want to dismiss that out of hand, more just to illustrate that it's more of a complicated problem that's going to take more than just, just give it a weak point for it to maintain overall balance. We've already seen things like the gunships kind of get nerfed into being almost too easy sometimes, right? And different enemies that I've seen a lot of feedback, and even myself might consider them to have been nerfed a little bit too hard. And I would really hate to see that happen to the Warstrider. I really like the enemy as its menace, with a few caveats. But at any rate, players, if they embrace teamwork dynamic, especially at the higher difficulties, I think you're going to have a good time. And for those people who do solo the game at like Super Helldive and stuff, hey man, good for you. That's really cool. I admire that dedication. But I don't think that solo play should be driving the balance philosophy for the game. Personally, my recommendation for the Warstrider, if it were to be rebalanced, would be to slightly reduce the fire rate of its weapon, maybe adding a couple seconds in between the volleys, or limit its grenade barrages to a finite number like they have done with the Rocket Devastator. I think this would preserve the menace of the unit and its uniqueness by being a very tanky enemy with area denial, but making it more consistent with the in-world trade-offs that we usually see in automaton designs, right? But enough about that. that pretty much wraps it up, though, I think. That's this month's recap of the good, the bad, and the ugly going on in Helldivers 2. Yeah. Like you, I love this game. That's why I take the time to dig into these types of issues. And loving something means being honest about its flaws, right? If Arrowhead can fix these bugs, improve stability, and smooth out some of these design inconsistencies and problems, then Helldivers 2 will continue to grow into a long-lasting co-op experience that I think everybody really wants it to be and appreciates it for doing. But polish is what's going to keep the player base happy and coming back in the long term. And I hope that they're able to continue on with that moving forward now that the Xbox release is behind them. But that's just what I think. Is there anything that I've overlooked, that I've missed? Maybe I've sort of dismissed offhand too flippantly? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, I appreciate your support, and thanks for watching.